Greetings, Nicola. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, well, let me get official, but not before pointing out the fact that this is another recording of your talk at ANZATS, given that we lost the original video feed, whatever. That's my mistake. Anyway, Warami, that's in the Sydney language. Good to see you, please.
Very good. Yes, well.
And you'd say?
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou.
Yeah, there you have it. To get in the same frame of mind, I'm Doru Costache. I co-convene with Nicola the special stream Faith and Science at ANZATS 2023. This annual conference of the Australian-New Zealand Association for Theological Studies is an event that shouldn't be missed, and I am so glad that I can now introduce Nicola and to, well, have the opportunity to interact with her on my own. Can you imagine this? So I'm a bit selfish in this one, so I welcome the loss of the initial recording. Now, Dr. Nicola Hoggard Creegan is an Auckland-based theologian and co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science. So I know you have included in your blurb the name in Maori, but my pronunciation. She has published in the interface between science and theology and eco-theology. She is also chair of the board of the Aotearoa Aotearoa, New Zealand, and chair of Kauni. Thank you. The governing board of St. John's College. Nicola is the author of Animal Suffering and the Problem of Evil, Oxford University Press 2013, and has co-edited 2 monographs with Andrew Shepherd, Creation and Hope, at With and Stock, and Taking Rational Trouble Over Mysteries, also with and Stock. She will be talking about Mātauranga Māori as context for science-engaged theology. Nicola, the floor is yours. I'm very much looking forward to listening again to you, and perhaps now free of the burdens of the day. I'll make more sense and get more of what you have to present.
Now you'll be able to give me some more curly questions. So thank you very much, Doru, for doing this session again. And thank you, anybody who's out there for listening. So this talk is about Mātauranga Māori and doing science and theology in the context of Mātauranga Māori. As this is a conference about context, and in New Zealand, that context increasingly is Mātauranga Māori. So Mātauranga Māori is a contemporary name for all that falls under the heading of Māori ways of knowing, including education, environmental knowledge, cultural practices, navigation, and astronomy. It is closely linked to the term whakapapa, which is used to explain not only genealogical lineages, but also taxonomies and classifications of plants and animals in a cosmic context. Whakapapa is, as Roberts and Wills say, to place in layers one upon another. Mātauranga Māori covers historical knowledge and its relationship to Western concepts like evolution, content that is not otherwise included in a science curriculum like healing properties of plants, but also the ways in which Wairua spirit is incorporated into and used in a much broader worldview than we normally work within. This allows, for example, a psychologist like Natasha Tassel-Matamua to study near-death experiences from both a subjective and objective standpoint within a psychology department. And it allows links to be made between evolution and whakapapa, which locates a Western theory like evolution in a more traditional understanding. A lively discussion has arisen in New Zealand around Mātauranga Māori and science because of plans to introduce Mātauranga Māori into high school science curriculum. And in fact, it's also being introduced in the university context as well. So some advocates of Mātauranga Māori insist that it is an equivalent and equal form of science in its own right, and it should be taught as science. For others, it is a deeper and wider way of knowing that extends to matters unreached by science, but where the complete separation of science from Mātauranga Māori creates uneasiness and dissatisfaction from a New Zealand treaty perspective. Mātauranga Māori has also produced huge controversy in the New Zealand science community. Some scientists arguing that impersonal, evidence-based double-blind trials have had enormous power, and anything that threatens to compromise pure scientific method is a travesty. Science, they say, is culturally neutral and has nothing to do with Western thinking, having its roots in Middle Eastern and Asian contexts. Others admit that it is helpful and just to acknowledge other cultural systems of thought and methods of evidence, and to include these in the science curriculum. Some think Mātauranga Māori should be included, but not under science. This is relevant to the science and theology dialogue in two ways. First, there has long been a discussion about whether science and faith are similar or quite different ways of knowing. Faith often can be understood as expanding the domain of what is known, and that the dialogue between faith and science is as relevant to science as it is to faith. But others have insisted that faith and science are non-overlapping magisteria, and the disciplines do not overlap. So obvious similarities here. Also, science and faith are often thought to be in conflict in the popular imagination, as are Mātauranga Māori and so-called Western science. The differences, however, are also clear. The conversation between theology and science has happened in the shadows. The Mātauranga Māori conversation is very public. Second, Mātauranga Māori is a wedge in the New Zealand context which breaks open domains of spirit and being in an otherwise secular, rationalistic society. Doru, do you think you could just pause for a minute while I go and get a glass of water? I understand that a comparison like this is contested. On the one hand, this paper is an appreciative Pākeha perspective. But on the other hand, I realize that the agenda of Mātauranga Māori is not to make my task easier. And to really understand the complexities of Mātauranga Māori requires long training and initiation. But Mātauranga Māori is the context in which theology and science are now done in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it would therefore be wrong not to interact with it. And furthermore, it is important in the current highly charged context of theology and society to emphasize that the Western tradition has not been homogeneous and that dissenting voices within it are important to any future rapprochement. So some approaches say Mātauranga Māori is equivalent to science, a different set of skills like navigation and astronomy and traditional classification, all of which have been forgotten in a Western approach. And others say Mātauranga Māori isn't equivalent, but it adds important concepts in and around scientific areas, broadening the semantic and concept field. All of these are familiar ideas to anyone who has navigated science and theology. And indeed, one of the frustrating elements of the post-colonial space is that Western philosophy and science are often spoken about as homogeneous disciplines, which of course they are not. In the space of science and theology, for instance, there are many voices. And while I admit that a reductive materialism has threatened to overwhelm both science and theology, that is by no means the only approach. There have always been dissenting voices, from the mysticism of Teilhard de Chardin at the beginning of the contemporary period, to process theology with its affirmation of mentality all the way down, panpsychism, deep ecology, and so on. So first of all, the present state of science and faith. There is an assumption of conflict at the everyday level and a strong thesis that there is no conflict at an academic level. It is well known that many people in the world out there assume that science and faith, and hence science and theology, are at odds. Modern secular universities are often suspicious of anything to do with faith, apart from lip service to the most superficial forms of spirituality. And large creationist churches seem to be still thriving, and in them there is a constant theme of conflict. These realities dwarf the more academic conversation where all claims that there is an essential conflict are properly refuted by contemporary and historical evidence. Needless to say, all of this means that the dialogue between science and theology is not easy. Nobody is really satisfied. And there are few institutions or platforms, especially in this part of the world, where the dialogue can take place. It is a marginal activity. And there remain deeper metaphysical and epistemological struggles. Many philosophers have noted that science can have a dampening effect on the spirit, subtly moving the person from a life-based view of the world to that of a machine. Everything is explained in terms of material causality. Science can have this effect of flattening the curve of life and leaving more of a cause and effect mechanism in its place. Philosophers have been at pains to argue that methodological naturalism is not metaphysical naturalism, but one does inevitably leak into the other. So second, science has traditionally been reductive, powerfully reducing problems to the study of smaller and smaller entities. And of course, this has worked. In this process, though, the whole is often forgotten, as are the deep connections between organisms in an ecosphere. Reductionism has been very effective, but there has also been a cost, again, in terms of how we view the world. The new sciences of ecology, in particular, have partially reversed this trend, but only partly. Thirdly, science often downplays the intuitive and imaginative aspects of its process, again flattening the process so that method, inputs, data, and conclusion are all emphasized over the imaginative and conceptual leaps that motivated and enabled the scientific process to happen. The recently deceased physicist Tom McLeish has noted that this has been so much the case that many young people are put off science for this reason. He worked hard to show how imagination was so very important in science. And the reality is that at least some scientists, often the most gifted and successful, the paradigm changes have significant, unexpected or serendipitous moments of inspiration, glimpses of what is there and how we can come to know what is there, and go on then to follow experiments which prove their intuitions. Really, though, are these intuitions discussed in a final paper? The professionalization of science often undermines common sense knowledge that is gained by pattern recognition outside the domains of science, knowledge built up anecdotally over time and so on, and traditional knowledge. Ordinary people feel squeezed out, and their own highly developed skills in pattern recognition are undermined. Fifth, science has emphasized parts of the model that fit an atheistic or agnostic worldview, especially in biology, where blind chance and contingency became central to biological dogma since the mid-20th century, and still are in some quarters. The tension with a creator providing God has always been enormous. And lastly, science works by producing models, and these become ubiquitous ways of imagining reality. And we forget that they are just that, abstractions and models, simplifications, in order to be able to manipulate reality. So how does Mātauranga Māori help with all of this? Christianity requires a belief in a God who breathes life into the world and upholds it at every point, in which the Spirit of God rests. Life pulses with the life of God. Moreover, God intends human beings and, in fact, all creatures. They are not the result of blind mistakes, even if they are not the result of an engineer either. And yet in the science and faith dialogue for many years, theologians essentially had to bracket this knowledge and the knowledge that life is not a machine, that life must be known subjectively as well as objectively, and that there is always more to what is real than our models can tell us. The dialogue, especially in the academic setting, has required that theology acknowledge that nothing divine can be seen in nature. And I should say that biology has changed, even if some do not count it as a paradigm shift. Part of the model we now emphasize includes the stunning constraints on the whole system, self-organization of complex systems, anticipatory co-option, the role of physics and chemistry, deep sympathy and altruism in many animal lines, the dynamism of niche construction, and so on. These modifications of the model allow us to sit more easily with the dialogue. But theology has always been on the defensive in this area. Process theology, for example, postulates life and actual occasions and all of everything within God, but not in a way that can be observed. This was always a part of the deal. Theology could say what it liked, just so long as we weren't insisting we could see it. So what is really interesting in the New Zealand context is that Mātauranga Māori comes with a decisive blow to Western materialism. Science, they say, and materialism is colonialism. There is no cowering under metaphysical branches and no apologies. Maori, life force, and whakapapa, and wairua, spirit, must be included in the same breath as any observations, scientific or otherwise, about the natural world. What we have long tried to say as subtly and apologetically as possible is now being said without any reservation, and with a whole intellectual apparatus that we could do well to encourage more broadly, and which is both deeply synergistic with all we want to say, but is also able to teach us a great deal. So I now want to look, therefore, in more detail, just briefly, at how Mātauranga Māori can help. And I am interacting here with a paper by Mary Roberts and Peter Wills from 25 years ago. Roberts and Wills were both prominent members of the University of Auckland, and at one stage they taught a course on Polynesian ways of knowing, Indigenous knowledge and Western science, perspectives from the Pacific. Their stunning chapter was in a book on tribal epistemologies published in 1998 by Ashgate, and their chapter is Understanding Maori Epistemology, a Scientific Perspective. So first of all, Mātauranga Māori in the context of the flattening of reality. With its central concept of whakapapa, Mātauranga Māori is never operating only at a phenomenal level. All individuals, plants, animals, places, whakapapa back to spiritual and divine entities, to other realms. Maori or divine life force, wairua or spirit, are always a part of the story. So not only is Mātauranga Māori never flat, it introduces deep layers of reality and the connection between beings in this world and the transcendent world of spirit. All of this is tightly held culturally, and there has never been the same temptation that there has been in the West to split off a phenomenally objective known sphere and deal with it separately and reductively. So Roberts and Wills, for instance, say in the 20th century, the investigation of organisms, their parts, products, and processes, based on physical principles alone, has deepened this intellectual rift between science and other systems of knowledge by reducing all analysis to empirical questions of material constituents and interactions, and the relative frequency of different categories of events. Molecular biology has precluded any critical discussion of its metaphysical foundations or completeness. In its most extreme form, for example, Dawkins, genetic reductionism defines an organism as nothing but a material vehicle, which happens in its historically imposed milieu to optimize the rate of reproduction of the DNA it carries. Mātauranga Māori is adamant that life cannot be reduced to material and contingent processes, which is exactly what older understandings of evolution insisted upon. Secondly, looking at causes and teleology, modern science gave up on Aristotle's 4 levels of causation, essentially eclipsing formal and final causes, and concentrating only on the material and efficient causes. And every now and then, some of us half-heartedly try to say, look, our affirmation of the final and formal causes does not threaten scientific integrity. But whakapapa is an even more powerful idea, essentially adding in layer upon layer of causation and meaning, something which is much closer to the truth. There are no dangling entities that are not tied to one another and to the divine. Whakapapa is a wonderful concept for resisting the temptation in Western science to collapse everything to the level of the phenomenal and tangible. It widens and connects, as is fitting for ecological sensitivity, and encourages us to see the whole, resisting the temptation to reduce and stay at the level of the smallest entities alone. Roberts and Wills also talk about how common sense and theory are therefore tightly connected in Mātauranga Māori. On the one hand, they say, Mātauranga Māori did involve close observation, categorization, and the passing of this knowledge down through the generations, all of which form the bedrock of scientific investigation also, as is the finding, they say, of unity underlying apparent diversity, regularity under apparent anomaly, and so on. And profound links are made between evolutionary theory more generally conceived and whakapapa. But whakapapa is the opposite of the random contingency in which modern understandings of descent were couched. Additionally, Wills and Roberts show how theory for Māori does not compete with common sense. Rather, they say, theory places everything in a causal context wider than that provided by common sense. And common sense and theory have complementary roles in everyday life. Abstraction is made and then also reintegration. Operating at more than one level is enabled by the use of metaphor, which resonates, as it does for us, at so many different levels. For Mātauranga Māori, however, this multiplicity of levels is embraced. And they say, all theories take their departure from the world of things and people and ultimately return us to it. In this context, to say that a good theory reduces something to something else is misleading. Ideally, a process of deduction from the premises of a theory should lead us back to statements which portray the common sense world in its full richness. And so far as this richness is not restored, by so much does theory fail. And they end by saying, this conception of the whole of reality as a continuous unfolding of vital generative processes, rather than as mechanical occurrences within inert material substance, is irreconcilable with most of modern science. However, the Māori worldview contains the seeds of a more sustainable relationship between humanity and the world that science studies. Assimilation of concepts like whakapapa and Māori into science would make it no longer possible, especially in biology, to separate questions of science and ethics. So in conclusion, the interaction here with Mātauranga Māori is necessarily brief and superficial. The paper by Roberts and Wills is unusual in its direct portrayal of issues from a sympathetic science perspective. A work on Mātauranga Māori by working scientists, and in Roberts' case, a Māori scientist. Much more work needs to be done, but for my purposes in this paper, I would like to reiterate how profoundly this has the potential to change the context for all of us, and how unusual this makes the New Zealand context. While I acknowledge that not all scientists are happy about these changes, I find the really quite sudden change in public discourse encouraging and potentially fruitful. Mātauranga Māori has the power to put science back into a wider perspective, to humanize it, to place it back into dialogue with common sense, to keep alive the depth of nature even while investigating it using scientific method. It encourages the integrative sciences of ecology and planet-wide systems that might help with climate change. But for our purposes, it also helps to restore a metaphysical balance that can only help Christians and those of other faiths as they navigate the often difficult paths of dialogue and integration in a world that has become increasingly conflicted. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Nicola. Thank you very much. Before we move to question time, to give you an opportunity to sort of fix your throat, just to show to our viewers who will be watching this recording where to find everything else. So it's well, my not-for-profit, the Australian Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies, and if you go to playlists, you'll find a number of them, including Relating Science and Religion. This was originally the name of a seminar I organized under Project Science and Orthodoxy around the world in 2017 with Peter Harrison and the regretted Dennis Edwards. But I have continued to upload materials, and all these things you see with distinct cover are from our Faith and Science stream at ANZATS 2023. So this is where Nicola's talk will be stored, and you'll have an opportunity to watch other videos of recordings of talks at the conference. Now, back to your excellent and challenging presentation. Let me begin on a slightly different note. You know, I'm theologically trained, and for like 9 years or so, during my PhD research, and then as a freshman in the Department of Systematic Theology of the University of Bucharest, I realized more and more how much I hated systematic theology. And one of the things that I could not pinpoint at the time what was problematic, why I hated that kind of method, or perhaps I didn't find the right words, although the intuition was there, is reductionism. Mm-hmm. This is an important concept in your talk. Reductionism, and I'm afraid that in our whatever modern age, it's not just the sciences that have become reductionist. Theology and other sectors of the humanities have become equally plagued by objectivism and reductionism, to the extent that we find ourselves no longer addressing things. We are talking about representations of things, models. So from a certain viewpoint, I think theologians, or especially systematic theologians and historians, could shake hands every time, anytime, at any pub, you know, with reductionist scientists. They will have so many things in common. Unfortunately, they don't realize how much they have in common, methodologically speaking.
Yeah, that's right.
That's one thing. So I decided at the time to get historical.
Right.
But realizing that I could not become a true historian, I did not want to become a true historian because of the same problem. Historicism is very problematic. It's a kind of positivism that keeps historical narratives away from things, and you know, stuck in the mud of reductionist models. So I have become a person of whatever, how to call that, an expat, literally and figuratively, not belonging anywhere. But I think
join the club.
Yeah, from this viewpoint, well, perhaps this is what keeps us talking together, talking to one another. But I think from this viewpoint, I very much resonate with the main message of your talk, that there's something else. It should be something else. And given that we are Christians, yeah, both of us are Christians, and I assume some of the viewers who are also Christians or have a sense of what Christianity is about, understand that for an incarnation focused mentality, reductionism is a no-go. I mean, we use models, and I'm happy to use models in my teaching and perhaps in research and stuff. But ultimately, we are supposed to meet reality, and Mātauranga Māori seems to be, or to serve us wisdom lessons that remind us of ourselves as Christians, I repeat, of what we're supposed to do. Instead of just juggling with words, we're supposed to meet reality.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think this is another, or the other side from my viewpoint, or from the perspective of my own, whatever expertise I can be labeled as having, that the problems that we have with reductionism in science are shared by many other fields, including the humanities. And this kind of discussion should be generalized to include theology and other parts of the humanities sector. Would you reckon that it'll take the same kind of effort to address the humanities, including theology, as it takes, for example, to address this kind of topic in regard to scientific reductionism, or is it a different kind of stuff?
Yes,
I know it's not your topic. Sorry.
Those are very big questions. I mean, I do think that the humanities, they don't like the big story that Christianity has anyway. So they would sort of distance themselves from us as well for other reasons. But I would see, I agree with everything you've said. I think that, and I agree, it does affect the humanities as well. I think partly because the humanities are always trying to compete with science and to prove how scientific and academic and objective they are, and how scholarly they are. And all of these disciplines have separated themselves from the natural world, and from immersion within the natural world, and from the enormous depth within the natural world. So that's why I think science can either help us, but it can also hinder us. You know, it can help us by showing us the extraordinary depth, almost infinite, and the imagination that is required for us to sort of indwell it. But it can also do all those things that I was talking about, you know, flatten us and make us feel dissatisfied because we're essentially separated from it. And that applies to the humanities as well, I think.
And I think to an extent, Nicola, well, look, our stream, faith and science required, you know, this focus on, let's call it theology and science. But I believe that the inertia is much deeper and severe, endemic in the humanities, including theology. So I include theology in whatever spectrum of the humanities. And it's very difficult to extricate these fields of human sciences, supposedly, from their abstract, idealistic world, to bring them back in reality. Perhaps the conversation with traditional wisdom like Mātauranga Māori or other indigenous forms of traditional wisdom could also help people working in the humanities to realize this impoverished universe horizon where they evolve, where they whatever pursue their goals, research goals, teaching goals, and so on and so forth, in order to become truly humane.
Yes, I mean, I do think that that theology has this fear of nature. I mean, and Christians have this fear of nature. They're afraid of getting muddled up with animism. They're afraid, you know, of paganism, all those sorts of things. And so there's been this deliberate withdrawal from nature, which is added to the general sort of reductiveness and materialism of everything around us. So it's possible that theology has even more problems than the humanities, although the humanities do also have this other problem of not wanting to look at big stories. But I do think McGilchrist has an awful lot to explain in all of this. So I don't know if you're familiar with McGilchrist's work, but
yeah, well, I'm a beginner. I heard of his work from you. So,
yeah, I mean, he talks about how, you know, we have these two ways of perceiving the world, you know, and the left brain one is just very, very simply, you know, out of, I think 2 kilograms of book, his latest book, is, you know, it sees the world as abstract, as a representation, not as the real thing. It tends to go round and round in abstract circles. It's divorced from most emotions, except perhaps for disgust and anger. And, you know, the right, and it's very, very, it allows us to focus on prey and to grasp onto it. Whereas the right brain way of perceiving the world includes the emotions, it includes the gestalt of something. It's much more participative, and it's much more in touch with reality. And so I think, and, you know, he has an awful lot of, he explains an awful lot of what we've been talking about, I think. And he says that our civilization is pushing us towards the left brain. The left brain tends to dissemble. It thinks it's got a good view of reality when it doesn't. And the right brain understands what's going on, but the left brain sort of thinks it can do without the right brain, you know. So if you get people with right brain lesions, they often can not realize how handicapped they are, because they have this lesion in the part of the brain that's actually helping them be in touch with reality. It's really quite extraordinary in what it is, you know.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. It's awesome. So this sort of encourages me. Well, this is another encouragement for me to keep digging up the wisdom of the patristic tradition. You know, the early Christian theologians. You know, like for instance Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century. He has, you know, these gems of anthropological thinking. And in a book called The Mystagogy, or Mystagogy, which means initiation into mystery. Let's see if I can trace it here. Do I have it? I don't see it here. It doesn't matter. So the Mystagogy of Maximus, or Mystagogy, I think it's chapter 5 or so. That's a small treatise of anthropology there within an ecclesiological contemplation for some reason. And he speaks there of 2 kinds of knowing. And he uses
right.
Yeah, and he uses the words, Greek words, logos and nous. Logos, we know, it means reason, thinking, words, message, principle, whatever. But in this case, logos has an analytical function. The other form of knowing has a different kind of, well, he doesn't call it the 2 hemispheres of the brain, but there's a different kind of approach, cognitive approach, which has to do with the concept of nous, N-O-U-S, where we have the word noetic, for example. And that one operates synthetically, not analytically. So analysis is to actually smash things to pieces and see the pieces, you know, like the tesserae of a puzzle or a mosaic. Bring them together, that's synthesis. Yeah, which means let's understand what we learned from those pieces that we have broken down, whatever, the object that we have broken down in pieces. So these 2 forms of knowing, analytical and synthetic, are supposed to lead us to a more complete picture of reality, which looks at details, but also at the whole in one go. So I think McGilchrist would be very interested in knowing that this kind of thinking predates our age, and sort of the same kind of thought comforts me for the ignorance that I show in regard to the many things that are being written in these last whatever years.
No, I think that's fantastic. I want to see all this work on Maximus the Confessor. C.S. Peirce also talks about firstness, secondness, and thirdness. About different ways of seeing reality as well. And of course, many theologians in the past, even though when they were quite rational, like Jonathan Edwards, also showed that they were deeply moved by nature, and that there was a sense of ethical truths being revealed in nature and the nature of God. He wrote Images and Shadows of Divine Things and things like that. So he was seeing deep symbolic reality of God in nature, and he of course could also be very rational, but
well,
at least these things are there together.
This is so enriching. Now, how do you make sense of this overpowering and apparently almost general tendency to embrace reductionist views, models, when we know that reality is so complex, when we know that there are so many ways of making sense of reality, and there are so many pieces of the puzzle that we need to put together, piece together. How do you explain this? Is it something subjective in this objectivism of the sciences, of the humanities, and so on and so forth?
Well, I think it was worse in the 20th century, in some aspects, with the intense, and I think there is an atheistic and an agnostic, well, really probably an atheistic agenda behind a lot of it. They want to eradicate spirit or even inwardness from conversation. So you've got behaviorism, which really wanted to eradicate all our inwardness. And I think we've withdrawn from that a little bit, but the deep sort of agnosticism in the culture means that it's very hard to recover it, because so many people don't really.
It's inertia again. It's some kind of cultural inertia. Okay, so we have militant atheists, whatever, new atheism and all that. But for the rest, for example, I talk to people, some hard scientists, others are soft scientists, and so on and so forth. And I see this kind of, well, look, to work rigorously, we need to go by those principles and abide by that methodology and so on and so forth. Well, but that methodology is something that came up in history, and maybe it's not the best that we can produce even tomorrow.
Yeah, I know. And in some ways, I think it has got worse, because in medicine, for example, nothing is real unless it's been discovered by double-blind trials, for example.
Yeah.
And yet there's all sorts of things that we know other ways. So yes, I think it has got worse, as well as slightly better in evolutionary science.
Yeah, I'm less familiar with biology and all that, but for example, I noticed in well, let's call them, broadly speaking, cosmologists. In the world of cosmologists, I noticed this sense of, well, look, our models apparently crack at some point. They all have some limitations, and these limitations, when we become aware of them, scream to us that we need a new kind of physics.
Exactly. And my first discipline was mathematics, and although mathematics is often considered to be very left-brained, it actually is very right-brained. And at the heart of mathematics, there are all these paradoxes. So mathematics, in the 20th century, tried to sort of say, let's put it all on a logical, axiomatic basis, and it failed. And so I often sort of think that, therefore, paradox is a sign of something legitimate and real. And but that's not a generally accepted.
Yeah, I know, but when you have more and more voices, I repeat, I don't know biology or whatever, the world of biology, but I hear more and more these among cosmologists, we need a new physics. We are at a point where our main models like relativity and quantum cannot be breached. They tried with all sorts of whatever superstrings and I don't know what M theory, but apparently no one remembers what M theory stands for.
I do think though that in physics though, even the theories that we have are mind-blowing. And so yes, I mean we don't have a general, generalized theory, and we do need some new physics and some new cosmology, but even the ones that we have, the approximations that we have, are absolutely mind-blowing. They're not any more, I mean what we believe is not any more extraordinary than what physics is saying. But most
and
people,
yet they look for stuff that sounds very much like what you call panpsychism. They speak of conscience as the root layer of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very exciting.
And these are real scientists, hard scientists, who dare to think, to have imagination. I love that part of your talk when you talked about these people actually don't have imagination. I love it. It's the same in theology, it's the same in history, whatever the humanities, and it's the same in the hard sciences. We are plagued by objectivism that kills our spirit to the extent that, well, how many charismatic scientists do we know today? Well, there are some whatever stars and whatever they are called, mega stars or whatever, but none of them can compete against the memory of Einstein, who with all those beautiful thought experiments triggered by facts of life, they cannot produce anything of that kind of revolutionary thinking. But they are seeking. Some of them are seeking.
Well, I mean, in biology, for example, though, I don't know if you've seen the book Entangled by Merlin Sheldrake.
No.
What about how there's this underworld of fungi and things like that actually undergird the whole of life, and we're all entangled with it. And he's Rupert Sheldrake's son, and there are things like that, and it's really a bestseller, this book. And so all of a sudden people are sort of starting to sort of see things as a whole, to understand that it's not, reductionism doesn't get us everywhere. In fact, we forget a lot of things if we do just reduce everything to its smallest, and that we also need to see the whole, and we need to see something like the fact that we're all dependent on this sort of fungal layer in the soil beneath us. It's a very interesting book. But also, he also talks about how he got involved in some experiment where they took psilocybins. They went into the experiment saying, what is it I need to work out? And they took psilocybins, and they sort of emerged from it with more theories than they would have otherwise, so that there is this, it's taking seriously the sort of imaginative leaps that you can't really control in science. And it's interesting for that reason also.
So they require, they're pointers towards the importance of intuition, which means that that at least again in the hard sciences there's this concept, and it's like as though boasting, we know it's non-intuitive. Okay, non-intuitive, fine, great. Some things are non-intuitive. I have never seen an atom in my life, and I assume no one did without a very powerful telescope. Oh, sorry, microscope. Okay, non-intuitive. But we still need intuition in order to bridge those abstract, ideal objects and our real life. This is where I believe your message about Mātauranga Māori or any other kind of traditional indigenous wisdom comes into play, because they teach us ways of looking at reality which are no less rigorous, but they are also much more holistic, much more comprehensive than our analytical approaches allow us to.
Well, analytical approaches allow us to separate our knowledge from what ordinary people intuit and know, and at least in the way that Peter Wills and Mary Roberts talk about it, there is this sort of bringing together of common sense and more abstract knowledge, which is very important in Mātauranga Māori. And but that makes sense because the metaphors sort of resonate at so many different levels. And
would Mātauranga Māori feel at ease, for example, with the perhaps less trendy idea today, but anyway, the so-called anthropic principle, where you have this integration or this bridge between rigorous cosmology and rigorous anthropology? Would that fit more into the schema of this holistic approach?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
I know.
I mean, it's amazing to me how many people are just discovering some of the anthropic principles and understandings and being really blown away by them. You know, I think there's been this discussion in science and theology for a long time about the anthropic principle, but it never sort of like penetrated down to, you know, ordinary people. When people discover these things, they really are quite blown away by them. So, yeah.
Yeah, look.
I think it would open up a world that Mātauranga Māori would say, well, we don't need that to see this because we can see it anyway. But I think it certainly helps us, you know, and Westerners see the extraordinary depths and interconnections of things.
Yeah. Well, actually, for instance, in my church tradition, in Orthodox Christianity, well, Byzantine Christianity, whatever, there are many forms of orthodoxy. I think it's traditional to think in anthropic terms, not anthropocentric. For example, we speak, well, the topic of the fall, you know, but we speak of a cosmic of cosmic reverberations of the fall, but also the fall means what you and I would do. Any human being, we all cause some kind of waves across the universe. But then it's the same in the lives of the saints, renewed people who manage to overcome the problem of sin, overcome their fallen condition. And what happens around them? They cause different kinds of waves, which are very positive. Instead of being destructive, they are constructive. And the more one advances on the path of perfection, the more one becomes more empathetic towards all beings and better connected with everything. Well,
that's really interesting because, I mean, that's very similar to what Schleiermacher would say.
Well, yeah. I haven't read that German guy. But this is something that my breed of orthodoxy says, well, in principle, since forever. But when I address topics like the anthropic principle, even with my students, who are supposedly Christians, they are still stunned and they don't want to get it. Well, what kind of cosmic responsibility do I have? How can I monitor and measure my input to the life of the Earth's environment or the cosmos for them? Well, you don't have to measure it. It's important to know that it is. So I think indigenous wisdom helps us to remember who we are or what Christianity is about. Christianity isn't about the soul, whatever, some kind of very selfish anthropocentric salvation. It's about the salvation of all life,
the whole cosmos. Yes. Yeah.
So how do things go? And that's out of sheer curiosity. How do things go on the ground in Aotearoa now? When I understand there are schools where Mātauranga Māori is taught, others refuse or something like that.
Do you want to pause the recording now? Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No. So
No.
so I understand that this is a transitional time, isn't it?
It's a very transitional time, and there are ardent factions on both sides and middle sides, and nobody quite knows also how it will really work. There's been a revision of the science curriculum which puts in place very broad concepts like ecology, and no one's quite sure how you're ever going to learn the periodic table. And so it hasn't been worked out yet, and
so these are early days,
very early days, really.
But I think it's still courageous, and I think it's important, to implement this kind of, well, perhaps it's challenging for Western mentalities, but to implement this kind of education and training that allows you to see the other side of things, from this viewpoint. I think the New Zealander experiment is praiseworthy and something to keep an eye on, because it's obvious that the current system, at least in what we call the West, doesn't work. It left us bereft of soul, of a sense of meaning, of integrality, of belonging.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, now I can switch off. Thank you very much, Nicola. This has been such an enjoyable conversation, but not as bright from my viewpoint, whatever. I mean,
no,
in terms of my input, compared to
your
your
input is amazing. It just resonates very, very, very well with everything. Yes, so thank you very much for recording this again and putting it up on your website.
It's my pleasure, and I'm very much interested in learning. This is why I ask.
Well, all I'm doing is learning too, so yes.
Thank you once again, Nicola.